Hello everyone and welcome to the SelfCare Backpack YouTube channel. Today we're going to do something slightly different in that I'm going to talk about my own experiences with mental health and mental illness and how they affect the resources that SelfCare Backpack offers. Because as I've said, all the resources that are out there are stuff that I either have used in the past or stuff that I do now and that help me and that may help other people. So I thought it'd be useful to give kind of context around those and why they work for me and how they connect to my own mental health and mental illness. So yeah, as always, my disclaimer, I'm not a mental health professional. Everything I talk about is stuff that affects me or stuff that I use or have used. Everyone's mental health is different. Things that help me may not help you. Your safety is paramount. If you do want to look at some professional resources, there's a link in the description to a page on the SelfCare Backpack website which lists a bunch of resources, helplines, stuff like that. If I'm missing some that you'd like to see on there, please do drop me a link in the comments or send me a message and I'll put that on the website and I can shout you out if you want, or you can remain anonymous if you prefer. Also, for this video, I want to talk trigger warnings. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I am going to talk about the effects of emotional abuse, and there is a big truck outside. You're just going to have to deal with that. The effects of emotional abuse and how, the survival strategies I used to get through that and how that's affected my mental health. I'll put timestamps in the description in the video for what I talk about when, so you can avoid sections that you need to. Again, your safety is paramount. Please look after yourself. I am a lady talking into a camera. You don't need to listen to me if it's going to make you worse. That's fine. Okay, so straight into the video. So I say that I have anxiety and complex PTSD. I have a diagnosis of generalised anxiety disorder. I don't have an official diagnosis of complex PTSD. It depends on which part of England and the country we're in when it comes to what the NHS kind of does. It's not really a thing that the NHS diagnoses. It can be quite difficult without going to a private psychotherapist to get a diagnosis in the UK of complex PTSD. But I mean, it's getting better, but it's still difficult, and I don't think I need that diagnosis. Trauma absolutely has affected my responses to things. I have trauma responses, and it came from emotional abuse as a child. So it fits. My symptoms fit the pattern of complex PTSD, and I am down with a little bit of self-diagnosis every now and then. So I say I have complex PTSD because I'm pretty sure I do. I've just never got an official to tell me, yeah, no, that's definitely what you've got. Because I don't think it's worth it. For me, anyway. So. Oh, I should explain what complex PTSD is, shouldn't I? Hang on. So, complex PTSD is essentially you have the symptoms of PTSD with some extra things on the top. The extra things can be things like difficulty controlling your emotions, constant feelings of emptiness or hopelessness, feeling as though you're completely different to other people, like nobody understands, finding relationships or friendships very difficult, and experiencing dissociative symptoms, and a bunch of other things. It tends to be It tends to be formed by witnessing or experiencing abuse as a child. It can also be things like being a prisoner of war or torture or kidnapping. PTSD usually forms when you experience trauma at a young age over a prolonged time. Escape or rescue were unlikely or impossible. Or you've experienced multiple traumas, or you were harmed by someone close to you that you should be able to trust. So that's kind of what complex PTSD is. It's PTSD with a little bit extra on the side, and it's generally formed over a longer period of time than PTSD, which can come from very short traumatic experiences, like one-offs, like being in an accident or suffering violence, once that can cause PTSD. Complex PTSD is different because it tends to be more prolonged. Okay. There we go. So the bare facts of my background as a human are, I am the eldest daughter, eldest of 4 children. We grew up poor. I went through periods of food insecurity when I was growing up. This was made worse by my family's distrust of the government, and so there were a lot of benefits that we didn't get, like free school meals. I absolutely could have qualified for those, we all could have, but we never got them because that would have meant giving details to the government about the earnings, how much money was in the household, things like that. My stepfather was emotionally abusive and very threatening, physically as well. So we moved in with him when I was 11. My brother was 6 and my 2 sisters hadn't been born yet. He was very abusive, very controlling, very threatening. He instantly did the whole thing of cutting mum off from all of friends and family and stuff. There was no escape. Because she was abused and because of the way that went down, I often had to step up and look after my siblings. I often had to cook food for them. I had to go down into downstairs from the room that I shared with my brother into quite a hostile environment. But if I didn't do it, no one else was going to. That included feeding myself, feeding my siblings when my baby sisters were born and they were babies, making bottles for them, all that kind of stuff, because my mum was unable and unwilling to step up, and my stepdad was unable and unwilling to let her, have these things. So I had to step up a lot in order to survive, really. Eventually I went to university. I was the first person on my maternal grandfather's side, possibly my stepfather's side as well, to ever go to university. It wasn't an option really for grew up poor, working class. It wasn't really a thing that we did, but I did. I managed to escape, go to university. I then got a job. I moved again, and then I got on meds and went into therapy. And then about 2.5 years ago, I cut off contact with my family for good. So I lost that kind of toxic element in my life, which is good. It's made my life an awful lot better. Those are the headlines, essentially. #tragic upbringing that has had wide-ranging effects on my life, mentally, financially, all that kind of jazz. So yeah, those are the headlines. I'm going to dive in a little bit and kind of explain how those affected my mental health and where these resources kind of came from. So I am very kind of caring and responsible because I've had to be. That's how I was worth things as a child, essentially, was being the eldest and being caring and responsible. And if I didn't do it, no one else would, and they'd probably do it wrong anyway. At least, that kind of control that you have to have. Those are my instincts. It's very hard for me to not do those things. I have to actively try not to. It's also really hard for me not to do all of the household tasks. Asking for help with household tasks is really hard because obviously my stepfather was very misogynistic as well, so obviously it was the woman's job to do all these things. So even though none of my partners have ever, they've all willingly helped out and been happy to help out because they're not awful humans, it's very hard for me to kind of ask and accept help for that. It's very hard for me to sit idle when other people are doing stuff. I find it very hard to let other people do things like cook or clean and me not doing anything, even if I'm not well, even if I'm in pain, even if I've done a lot of work and now and they're doing their share. It's very hard to disengage those things. And I add the emotional volatility that came from my household. I'm also I try to manage other people's emotions as well. I'm very fawning. I'm very, I don't want, if I think someone's angry, I will try and manage that around them. And I will assume people, like it's not too bad now, but it was a point where if someone I was friends with or a partner wasn't like, not like unhappy, but just generally just not happy, do you know what I mean? Like everyone has off days, I would just go into overdrive anxiety wise. I would have to talk myself down of just trying to make them happy again, even though I knew and I know that you don't have to be happy all the time, that's really unhealthy, but my brain was like, oh god, they're not happy, I need to make it better, otherwise they'll be really angry. It's very unhelpful, but that's what I was used to, so that's kind of what I did. I also have a terrible fear of failure, obviously, because failure was something that was punishable and you were ridiculed for in the household. So failing, especially failing by doing something and failing as opposed to not trying at all, is something that I've had to learn to get better at and to get used to, because sometimes trying to do something and failing is the only way to learn things, and that's very hard. But I'm getting better because therapy works for me, which is good, and I'm very privileged that talk therapy works for me, that I found a therapist that works for me and I can afford to pay him, you know? All that kind of stuff, all that kind of symptoms is why it took me about 2 years of effort to actually get any kind of diagnosis and help. So I only made an appointment when I was really struggling, because of the context of growing up poor and doing everything in my power not to ever move back to my parents' house. It meant that really struggling for me was struggling to hold down, like work was becoming a struggle. It was, I would work and do nothing else. So I go to the doctors and then had me the form, and the form I got when I was there, this is what, must have been about 7, 8, probably longer, 9, 10 years ago, something like that. Yeah, probably about 10 years ago when I first started to get help. The form was basically just a depression screening form, so it focused a lot on self-harm and suicide ideation and the kind of depression that I don't suffer from depression. I suffer from anxiety, but I've never suffered from depression, so none of it really applied to me. So they'd say I'm not depressed, and that was the end of the conversation, really. There was no further questioning about what could be wrong with me. It was, you're either depressed or you're not, and that's how it's going to go. So it took me a long time to figure out the words to say, essentially, to get help from the doctors. I had to do a lot of research myself. And part of it was because I was still able to function, but like, and seen as functioning, I could hold down a job. But that's because the other option was possibly having to move back to my parents' house, and that wasn't an option, so I had to carry on. Do you know what I mean? It was one thing where it was that I'll be on the street. It wasn't that I'll be on the street. I had a partner at the time who would absolutely have not allowed that to happen, but anxiety lies to you, and that's how it went. I was convinced they were going to get sick of me and my anxiety and leave. Anxiety lies to you all the time, so it's quite a stressful time. Eventually I found the words to say to get help, and I managed to get help, and I managed to get a doctor who listened to me and figured out that even though I wasn't depressed, there was definitely something not right with me. And I got some cognitive behavioural therapy on the NHS, and I got on medication, which worked for me, thankfully. So the reason I didn't really know how to explain to the doctor what was wrong with me is because I've never had a panic attack. Never had a panic attack in my life, thankfully, I guess. But it's quite hard to get diagnosed with anxiety if you've never had a panic attack, because that's generally how it goes. Due to my upbringing, I fell back a lot on the grey rock method of survival. So when you're in the presence of someone who can be manipulative or abusive, the idea is that you become a grey rock. You emotionally detach, you become boring, you basically smooth away anything that could be seen as a target. So you just learn to disengage entirely, and I learned very well how to do that. I just became this like blank slate that would never say anything or do anything that would be worthy of attention because that might be bad. So I learned how to do that. That was a survival tactic really quickly. That eventually grew to disassociating from my emotions entirely if I couldn't deal with them. So if I got triggered in any way, I would disassociate entirely. Because it worked so well for me, my upbringing, right? If all else fails, just shut everything down. And my body took that to a bit of an extreme. So, and it worked quite well actually. I mean, it wasn't healthy, but I could get through work and things, just disassociated entirely from everything. So this is what dissociation looks like for me. There are many different ways, many different forms of dissociation. There's things like depersonalization, where you don't feel that anything or yourself is real. There's derealization, where you're not sure that anything you're doing is real and everything feels very fantasy-y. But yeah, dissociation for me felt like this. So my heart would start to pound. It wouldn't necessarily be quickly, but it would be hard. I would get tunnel vision. But it also kind of felt like I was at the bottom of a well almost. So tunnel vision, but also I was very far away from what I was seeing, and it couldn't really interact. I couldn't really interact with it. It felt like it couldn't interact with me. It was almost like I was in like a mech suit or something, you know? And so the body was working, but no, it's not like being a mech suit. It's really hard. Like, I didn't feel like I was actively making any decisions, but I clearly was making decisions. I was getting through the day at work, and I was doing stuff. And I worked in a pharmacy. I was a dispenser at the time. So I was dispensing meds and, you know, going through the motions of putting prescriptions through and all that stuff. But I have no memory of those days. Like, I would go home. Then it was safe for me to, you know, feel all my feelings and stuff, and I would have no recollection of the day that I've just come from. It was like just waking up. So that's kind of what it was like. That's what I was doing. That every time I had an emotion that I didn't want to engage with, or something that felt too overwhelming, I would just not feel it, opt out of that whole thing, and opt out of actively engaging with life in any way, and forming memories. And it's quite hard to explain that if you don't have the words to explain it, you know what I mean? It's not something you can really talk to a doctor about and explain well, I don't think, or at least I didn't feel that at the time. So this is why I track my mood. This is why I talk about checking in with your feelings a lot and doing all of that, because I mean, mood tracking has multiple uses if it works for you and if you can do it. First of all, checking in with your feelings. That is really useful for me, just being aware, just making sure that I'm engaging with my feelings, seeing how my feelings feel in my body, also very useful for me to keep on top of, because since being on sertraline, so I take sertraline, I don't really dissociate anymore. I have sometimes done something similar to that, a lighter version almost, and so I do try to keep on top of feeling things, just to keep on top of that and make sure I'm still doing it. It's also helpful to have evidence you can take to a doctor and go, look, see, my mood has been terrible. And there's a bunch of other stuff. I think my first video in 2020 is going to be mood tracking and all the stuff that it can give you. So I'm going to do that in a couple of weeks. But yeah, so tracking my mood is really important to me because it's very healthy compared to what I was doing beforehand, you know? I grew up being gaslighted, essentially. That happened a lot in our household, to the point where I would occasionally, and still occasionally do, gaslight myself. Like, I will doubt myself entirely. I'll tell myself that I clearly imagine things. The thing that used to happen a lot, it doesn't happen this year, one, because 2020, and also because I'm getting better, is that I would arrange to meet someone, and I would get there, and if that person was a minute late, I would have to check that I got check that we'd made the message that we sent each other to make sure that I got like the right time, the right date, the right place, because instead of them being like 2 minutes late, it was easier for me to believe that I had got something wrong than that they were running a normal amount of time late that you wouldn't warn anyone about because it's 2 minutes. That's kind of how deep the doubting went, and doubting my own self. So things like that, the things around like the boundaries that I've set, and the stuff around boundaries that I've put out, the encouragement cards, that kind of thing about believing in yourself, is stuff that I need just to encourage myself to not doubt my own brain, really, because it's really easy to do that. I take notes a lot, and there's multiple reasons for that. I find that I remember things a lot easier if I write them down, but also it's nice to know that I've got a record of things. So if I do, because sometimes I forget, but I've also got the thing, if I ever doubt myself, I've got that as well. I try not to fall back to that, because the worst thing for anxiety is giving into it and checking on it. But if I'm ever in a position where it gets too bad, I can fall back on that. I try not to. I try to trust myself a lot. And again, it's getting better. Cutting off my family and removing that toxic influence made things a lot better, obviously, because no one else in my life does that stuff. I have wonderful people around me. But this stuff isn't easily forgotten. These habits aren't easily breakable. So that's the kind of thing that I do around that. That's why I also think about writing stuff down is really important. It's also really helpful because you've got to put things into some kind of coherence. So it's quite good to write your feelings out or write your thoughts out, so you can kind of look back and see what's going on. Also proves that your brain is telling the truth as well, because your brain, sometimes is being honest about things, So that's really important. So all that kind of points as to why it took me 2 years of trying to get help, because I don't look like your average anxiety haver, I have trauma responses instead, and it's hard for the NHS and GPs, especially, they are general practitioners, to kind of screen for that stuff, especially if you can't say I have anxiety, because I didn't know back then. I didn't really understand. I'd not really had any experience with anyone talking openly about mental health issues, which is another reason why I talk about them so openly, because it might help someone else. It might give someone else the words that they need to get help, because I didn't. It took me ages to figure this stuff out. It's hard. Brains are tricky. So yeah, that's why I do the things I do. This is the context. Yeah, and I just hope that I can help other people. Maybe someone in a similar position to what I was in a decade ago, struggling and not knowing what the fresh hell is going on. Let's talk a bit about trauma, shall we? Trauma responses are weird. I get flashbacks, mostly emotional flashbacks, rather than I'm back in that kind of thing flashbacks. So I'll just have these intrusive memories, I guess, of things that have happened, of the way and I feel exactly like I did back then. All the feelings exactly back, and then that can lead to dissociation, which isn't healthy. So I have to try and work through those a lot. They happen a lot this time of year, because Christmas used to be pretty much the only time I go back to see my family, and so I have a lot of muscle memory around Christmas that isn't ideal. I enjoyed Christmas, that's the thing. I like the idea of Christmas, and I'm slowly starting to get the Christmases that I want. This year just stopped me seeing most of all of my friends pretty much, apart from my partner, who is also a friend, you know what I mean. So yeah, it's outgrowing those thought patterns. It's why, again, I talk about catching your thought patterns, writing things down. Because your brain has patterns, it takes shortcuts, and sometimes they're useful, and sometimes they're really harmful. And for me, that's what therapy's been good for, is talking about these assumptions and thought patterns that I make, and my therapist going, but does it have to be like that though? And me going, probably not, And so that's kind of what I've found really useful, is talking through those thought patterns, or writing through those thought patterns, and trying to break them, see what I can fill them with instead, So yeah, I didn't really write an ending for this video. I hope some of the stuff I've said has been useful. I wanted to focus a little bit more on how like trauma intersects with anxiety and how it looks different for me and how that affects me, as opposed to a dive into all of my mental health issues. If there is anything you'd like me to expand on, any questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to ask them or feel free to message me. I am happy to talk about this stuff openly. I grew up, actually that's another thing I could talk about, I grew up with a lot of shame around the way I was brought up and the things that happened to me, because that's how abuse works. I am no longer ashamed of any of that, and I've kind of gone almost the opposite way in that I am quite open now, whereas previously I would hide a lot of things and be ashamed. That is not the case now. I'm more than happy to talk openly and freely about things. I've linked a blog post that I wrote last year in the description about kind of the identity crisis I had when I cut off contact with my family. So read that. I'm really proud of that piece of writing. I would love to have you read it, assuming the trigger warnings, there are trigger warnings there. Take care of yourself. But yeah, if there's anything else at all, please do ask. I'm happy to talk. Again, I'm not a therapist. I'm not your therapist. But I can certainly share my experiences. I would love to have you subscribe, like, comment, all that jazz on the video. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time in the new year, talking about mood tracking. Stay safe, be kind, look after yourself, and I'll see you later. Bye!